Hi and welcome to this interview. I'm Juri and I'm an animal rights activist from Sweden. And my pronouns is he. And welcome, JW. Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm JW. Pronouns are they, them. I'm a fourth year musicology major and philosophy minor at University of California, Los Angeles. Um, yeah, I'm a part of the UC Stop the Slaughter initiative as part of the education team. And currently working with rather the UC Animal Studies initiative, which is looking to start animal studies curricula at different University of California campuses.
Interesting. You kind of mentioned something about, was it some activism or tell us a little bit about yourself and your activism.
Yeah, so
What are
at
you?
least with regard to, I guess, formal organized activism, I'm fairly new actually. I just joined the University of California Stop the Slaughter campaign, which is kind of a UC-wide campaign that's looking to basically end non-human agriculture. But I started doing that this past January, and so I've been a part of their education team, which is kind of looking to foster some, for lack of a better word, like educational initiatives for the public and for other students around the campaign. So it's kind of like a supplementary initiative. And then kind of out of that, I've started working on what we're calling the UC Animal Studies Initiative, which, since animal studies is kind of it's a field that's not really formalized at a lot of academic institutions. And so we've had a lot of interest, at least so far at UCLA, because that's where I'm based. And as of yet, we haven't branched out too much into other campuses. But for starting actually a minor to start with, and then I think we're going to push beyond that if we can at all. But so at least that's kind of also related to my work with Stop the Slaughter, working with a lot of the same people there. But in terms of, I guess, my personal background and relationship to non-human activism, is I actually came through it through scholarship. So I study musicology technically. That's where my training is, but a lot of the topics I look at are related to the intersections of like sound, voice, and critical animal studies. Um, and so I think it was about a year or two ago, I started getting into, I guess, like critical animal studies scholarship within what I'd been reading. I went to this, funnily enough, a musicology conference, the American Musicological Society's annual conference last year in Boston. And the first panel that I ended up at this point, I was not, my research focuses were like 19th century, 20th century Western art music. I was like big into Mahler at that point and like symphonic structure. And so that's what I was looking to do. But then I went to this conference, and the first panel that I attended was called Plants and Animals. And it was kind of these post-humanist approaches to music and sound. And so there I was kind of like struck. I was like, whoa, this is super interesting. I didn't know this was actually something that people formally studied in the academy. And then from there, I was just completely hooked. I'd always, up until that point, maybe I'd always been interested in working with other animals. At some point, I almost went to college for like zoology, and I was looking at potentially maybe becoming a veterinarian at one point. And then I ended up doing film and then transitioned to music. It was a really weird kind of kind of journey. But so that was always kind of lurking in the back of my mind. But then I started getting into the scholarship and getting into actual like animal studies. And then from there, that was kind of my entry point. I had a few friends that were in non-human advocacy, And so then I started getting connected into networks there. And then now it's kind of this two-pronged approach for me. One on part of my scholarship and then another on like public activism. Like my senior thesis this year, because I'm graduating, it's on representations of red foxes in Western cultural practices. And so for me, it's important that I take this kind of dual approach to activism, one on writing, and then actually action. So yeah.
So what made you like want to have, or like what sparked your interest in animals or animal rights activism, and this what you were saying about that sound things about nature and animals?
Yeah,
Did it come like suddenly when you discovered this, or I mean, because you were thinking about studying veterinarian, and
because when I guess growing up, I'd always been interested in other animals to some capacity, and I thought at one point there were a lot of points where I didn't really know what direction I was going in, but I thought that one of my options I was looking at was to maybe pursue something in like the natural sciences and maybe ecology or something like that. And so that interest had always been there because, yeah. And then I ended up doing more arts, humanities stuff in reality. And then I guess, yeah, I went to this conference and then at the book expo. So I went to this panel with the plants and animals and it was talking about questions of, I guess, vocal ontology in certain pieces, comparing the human and non-human voice as kind of like a conduit for like evaluative ethical judgments. So like of something, people tend to demarcate personhood or like categories of personhood based on what people sound like oftentimes. And so like howling or like barking or like any kind of non-human vocalization is often used in the service of exclusion from this like I guess community of humans and all the things that come with that legally and morally and everything like that. And so a lot of the times if you're talking about sound and music, the sounds of other animals are used in this kind of demarcation of personhood. And it has been used, if you look at like colonial archives, indigenous and other sorts of marginalized people in the history of Western colonialism or European colonialism rather is they tend to label like the voices of other peoples as more like animal-like. And you can talk about a whole lot of things there. So it was kind of in this realm. And then at the book expo on the way out of the conference, I picked up is Rachel Mundy's Animal Musicalities, talking about how we've kind of founded modern conceptions of taxonomy and categorical difference off of the sounds of other animals and to a greater extent, maybe the bodies of other animals, whereas like a lot of modern recording technology comes out of experience with animal vivisection in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So I was thinking about these like material approaches and it really struck me. And then getting into there, I just started going on a tangent with all of these different kinds of veins of animal studies scholarship. And then I guess last spring I did a course paper for a class on the Czech composer Leos Janáček's The Cunning Little Vixen, which is an opera. And I was looking at representations of non-human animals in there and kind of seeing what that was doing. Because at least with regard to studies of representation, other animals are kind of left by the wayside a lot of the times. Like we can critique perhaps problematic representations of marginalized bodies, but it kind of stops at the human within a lot of scholarship. And so I was maybe looking to push that a little bit and say, okay, it's one thing to see a problematic representation of some kind of group on stage, maybe we can apply that same kind of logic to other animals if we want to take seriously the fact that other animals have subjective lives and experiences, which they do unquestionably. So yeah, and then that was kind of my entryway into all of this. And then I was looking to get more involved in the public sphere with activism. And that's where I found the Stop the Slaughter and animal studies initiatives and stuff like that. And so I'm pretty new to organized activism as it is. But I'm really interested in getting more involved, especially after I graduate. Hopefully have a little bit more time to do things on the side and volunteer.
Nice. Yeah, I kind of relate to your like feeling of not knowing exactly where what path to go in life. I've been interested in also, like you mentioned, like aesthetics or the creative things, and then also interested in like more technical or medical, but it's so difficult nowadays. But you mentioned opera, and I love opera, and um, I can really relate to what you said there as well. It's like sometimes you can hear almost like bird sounds with their instruments, and yeah, considering
so,
if it's really old music, then it's like, wow, they did some really awesome things with the instruments, you know.
yeah, it's really interesting because when you look at, I guess, most of the times that non-human animals are invoked in musical settings, or at least traditionally, it's often mimetic, and so they're trying to imitate the actual vocalizations of other animals. And so a lot of the times, at least within Western art music, it's birds. They default to that because something about the seemingly proximal nature of birdsong to human music making practices. Because tonally they seem similar, and the rhythmic elements seem similar, and that's something that's been remarked upon for a long time, basically. But so I guess when I was looking at my, in the context of I guess my current work with red foxes and the cunning little vixen, I was interested in how representation was working in regards to those animals who may not have like as clear sonic links to like musical representational strategies. So like red foxes, for example, like the common person would probably not know what a red fox sounds like, because at least if they're listening to musical settings like the cunning little vixen, nowhere in there you're going to find actual like imitations of fox vocalizations. And so I was curious about this kind of defining species archetypes in the negative, sonic archetypes in the negative. And so it's interesting, at least with the cunning little vixen, or the titular vixen, kind of she's the representational strategies that are used for her kind of default more to gesture and like textual characterization that's kind of derived from older like folkloric traditions of like animal fables, so like Aesop's fables, and then the like Renardian fox that's gone through so many iterations. And so it's a lot of this like behavioral stereotypes of like sneakiness and cleverness and stuff like that. Whereas like she comes into contact with chickens, for example, and they're actually defined by their sonic characteristics. It's like musical, like the vocal lines are fashioned, so it's like clucking and like cuckoos and stuff like that. And so it's really interesting where you get this kind of differing musical schema, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, of animal vocalizations. And so I was interested in like, okay, what does it say about the degree of personhood that humans tend to bestow on certain species of animals and not others? So I could talk a lot about that. We don't have to go into that, but that's something that's really interesting to me.
It's really interesting. And as you mentioned before, like how you're perceiving some people differently, and you mentioned like how the colonies were like thinking of native people as more animal-like in their their sound of their language. It's kind of, it sounds a little degrading almost, but I'm also thinking about making a little jump here. Fish, for example, you don't really hear them, so it's like easier for people to think, okay, they don't feel anything, you know, and then maybe that's why some people are pescatarians, or yeah, just a fancy word for what you prefer killing. Someone
Exactly.
said, yeah.
Yeah, sound. Well, that, I guess that's my interest in sound, is there's basically how you sound, or how you think others sound, or you think others should sound, carries with it all of these like ethical, valuative assumptions and judgments. And so what I'm interested in is in kind of like teasing and unpacking those so that they become more obvious. So yeah, it is really interesting. That's interesting about the fish. I haven't thought of that before.
It's so fascinating because it's like psychology mixed with nature and then music, and you got some kind of a mix of all of these. It's really awesome. And it's like, I haven't really thought about that. There, I mean, as you were surprised by what you saw on that conference, or where you were. I'm totally surprised by all of this. Like, wow, that's really awesome. So, but by the way, how did you? What made you go vegan, or like how did you, you know, get to that step and think about animals and all?
So that was kind of parallel rather to my whole, I guess, path into these different kinds of scholarship, and then eventually to activism. It was around the same time that I was, honestly, it kind of came as a big, it comes like this for a lot of people, I feel like, but it's just this major paradigm shift mentally for me, at the point where I'm starting to read the scholarship and get more knowledgeable about these things that I've just really not been thinking about before, because this like human exceptionalist framework is just so embedded in every aspect of our lives. And so the point where I went vegan was basically, I think I've been vegan for a little over a year now. And so that was the point where I was actually starting to write in a scholarly fashion about these things. And it came to my family had been, so I'm from Virginia, on the East Coast. And so I was living there at the time, because this was right in the midst of the onset of COVID and everything like that. And so my close family had been vegan for about 2 years at that point. And so when I was home, I would be eating vegan, just because that's what my family was doing.
That's really awesome.
Yeah, but I hadn't like fully gone vegan at that point but I was used to doing that, and I was like, oh, it's not like, just from I think that's maybe the biggest thing that people don't get over, is just the convenience factor. And then once you realize, it's like, at least I'm in a position where for me it's not incredibly inconvenient to like simply not buy animal products. And then that, coupled with the, I guess, the mental shift I was having, it just made it very easy for me. Yeah, so that's probably about the point where I went completely vegan.
That's really cool. So it's kind of like you discovered it, but also your family was vegan. But then when you like, before you completely went vegan, was it like that when you came home you ate vegan, but then if you went out you could eat a little whatever? Or...
Yeah, I wasn't really strict about it for a while, and then because my family had gone vegan for health reasons basically, and then they were they were watching all of those like environmental documentaries and factory farming documentaries and stuff like that. And so they were really trying to get on plant-based diet. And so, yeah, when I was home, I'd eat, but then I was not really strict when I wasn't home. Yeah, until probably about a year ago. And then it's such a sudden thing. And then for me, it's really interesting because I can't really imagine like eating animal meat now. Like it really kind of freaks me out and it's disgusting to me. Whereas before I didn't even have a problem with it. So it's really, really interesting from a psychological standpoint, because as I guess people involved in activism, it's one of those things where you're like, oh, like not this isn't this. I don't want to essentialize, but a lot of people tend to take the position, and myself included, in certain circumstances where it's like, oh, like I want everybody to be vegan, like that'd be absolutely perfect. Like I can't believe people are not vegan. Whereas like my state of mind before that is just completely different. And I've only been vegan for like I don't have any moral high ground to stand on because I've only been vegan for a year. And so it's like it's this really tricky thing that's so, I guess, morally compelling once you do it. It's really interesting, and I'd like to maybe explore that a little bit more from a psychological standpoint.
I can totally agree. I mean, with the fascination of the psychological point of view, because like why people go vegan, why others don't, and the whole mindset of a vegan. Like why are we all vegan? Like what made us go vegan? For me, it was that I always like remember eating animals, and it was like a bit disgusting, kind of like what is this? It's what's getting stuck in the teeth, and then I changed from one school to another, and was like, oh, do you want to eat vegetarian? I was like, yeah, why not? So it was like when I got the question, then it was like, yeah, sure. So that was how I discovered it. Like you discovered it also in well, in your way. So like, do you have any role models that inspired you, like to become vegan or to do activism?
That's a good question. As far as becoming vegan, no. I don't, at least not off the top of my head. Because for me, I guess like being vegan is like, for me personally, at least, it's the least I could be doing from a practical standpoint. I probably wouldn't advocate that it's the solution to everything, right? But at least from my perspective, it's kind of the bare minimum for those who are able to do it. And I don't want to generalize because there are legitimate reasons why somebody would not be vegan. And so at least for me, once I started actually getting into like, for me, it was really these scholarly arguments, which is interesting because I feel like not a lot of people come to it that way, but because that was kind of what I was into at that point, very clearly being laid out, oh, hey, like, did you think about how other animals might have moral subjectivity? Or did you think about this? And then learning all of these different things where I hadn't even really thought of before, I was like, wow. And then I was like, okay, my next thought was, okay, what can I do now that I know these kind of violences and atrocities that are going on that I hadn't even considered before and just taken for granted? To me, it was very simple. It was just like, okay, well, the first thing I can do is go vegan because I have the capacity to do so. And so that was basically it for from a dietary standpoint. As far as role models getting into activism, just because I'm looking to hopefully begin a PhD in the next few years. And so my goal is kind of to be a scholar. And since I am so new to organized activism, I perhaps don't know too many leading figures in that regard. But as far as scholarship goes, Donna Haraway is super influential on me. Yeah, what else? And thinking through these like kind of multi-specific entanglements and questions. I mentioned Rachel Mundy's book. Has been super influential on me as well. She's a musicologist / sound studies scholar. I think she's at Rutgers right now. Yeah, that's difficult. I'm not sure if I could name it's. I feel like I've been getting different strains of thought from all different places, and at this moment, at least, I'm not sure where to credit direct influence, because there have just been so many very good thinkers that I've been reading recently. But then maybe at a more casual level, the people that I've met within the organizations I've been a part of are very inspirational to me. They've just been doing a phenomenal job in organizing the different initiatives that have been going on in organizing protests and outreach events and stuff like that. And I'm just really happy that I could be a part of it, because at least for me, I feel like my skill set is not so much going out and advocating in a public way, although I'm looking to do more of that. But for me, that's very hard. And so it's been really, really cool for me to still contribute kind of from a behind the scenes way as part of like the education kind of teams. Because for me, I'm much more comfortable writing about things and disseminating information that way than getting up on a podium and saying things. So it's really cool, because I'd always kind of in the back of my head discounted this kind of public activism. It's like, oh, like that's terrifying to me. Like, I don't know if I could do that. I'm not like a very extroverted person. Like I'd love to, like I wish I could do that, but I just don't know if I have the capabilities. And so it's really cool to find this little niche that I can actually feel like I'm helping out in a way. So I'm really thankful to all the people in Stop the Slaughter and the UC Animal Studies Initiative that I've been working with for giving me that opportunity.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, there's so many people doing different kinds of activism, and there's so many opportunities now with like internet and the pandemic. I mean, we're talking online like this, and it's like comfortable. Everyone is used to it, so it's like so many new doors opening. And have you seen some kind of connection between your studies and activism somehow? Like, is there a connection between them?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me at least, if I'm looking to do scholarship, to me that is a form of activism, and for me it has to be a form of activism, because a lot of the time there's this perception of scholarly work as kind of existing within this elitist ivory tower vacuum that only other scholars read, and to a degree that's true of a lot of scholarship. And so what I'm maybe looking to do is really trouble that and make my scholarship not only something that is explicitly entangled with questions of liberation, but also accessible to non-scholars. There is a place for doing scholarship in a very technical fashion for other scholars to advance certain questions within disciplinary thought. But then at the same time, it can't just be that, right? It has to extend, for it to actually mean something, in my opinion, it has to extend beyond the walls of the academy. And so that's what I'm really trying to do, which is why I'm so interested in the emerging kind of subfield of critical animal studies, which maybe in contrast to fields like animal studies or human animal studies, as they've been called. So maybe for those who are not familiar, animal studies is not really a unified field, and I feel like traditionally it's used to talk about forms of research more maybe in line with like ecology and behavioral ethology and stuff like that. More on the maybe natural sciences side, biological sciences side, looking at other animals from maybe an empirical point of view. But I guess what I'm more interested in is this critical animal studies perspective, where it's explicitly from its inception married to non-human activism movements and individuals. And so it's really stressing this practical application to these sorts of scholarship. And so for me, I'm construing activism and scholarship as these two kind of separate domains, but I think it might be beneficial to collapse them in a certain way where we're not setting up this binary and looking at them as two separate things. Because I think any responsible activism has to incorporate these critical perspectives that some scholars are so good at putting forth. And at the same time, you can't just write about these things and not do anything. Like, the point of writing is to inspire change, in my opinion, at least with writing on these kinds of topics. And so going forward, I'm trying to explore more ways of integrating these different streams of inquiry, I guess. And so if I'm looking to be trained as a scholar, I feel like that is something that I could really help bring to the table in working with other activists.
So when you mentioned like you want to discover and study about the animals and kind of something with the animal rights or animal liberation kind of like perspective towards, I mean, the ethics about animals, and do you feel that that's like a lonely journey for you, or is it something that the university like UCLA actually encourage, or do they ever talk about animal ethics at all? Or
it definitely is lonely to some degree, but there are a lot of people doing this kind of work, albeit in very kind of disparate fields. And so that's what's so interesting about the kind of topics I'm looking to do research in, is it feels like especially within, so as a musicologist, there is hardly anything from this kind of perspective in, I guess, maybe what you want to call traditional musicological literature. There are a few scholars working in this vein, and in different disciplines there are also different numbers of scholars. The task, I guess, is to kind of cross over these disciplinary boundaries, because if you are working with these kind of questions, you can't really remain within the discipline from which you're getting your training. And so what I've really been having to do and been looking to do in my personal research and my work going forward is to make this work is inherently interdisciplinary. And so really kind of expand my networks and not really think of disciplinary boundaries when I'm going about asking these questions. As far as institutional presence goes, there's not really too much formal stuff at UCLA, for example, which is part of the reason why me and other people are trying to start curricula. And actually, so right now we're trying to start a minor at UCLA for animal studies. It's an interdisciplinary minor. And so we've been reaching out to professors to kind of gauge interest and see if anybody would support or perhaps teach classes that could fall under the minor. And we found a decent number of professors that have expressed interest in doing this kind of work and have kind of been doing animal studies related work on the side for a number of years, but just it hasn't been their thing because it's not really viable. It hasn't historically been viable in the academy as like a respected area of work. which is changing, thankfully, in recent years. And so we've been finding all of these scholars and grad students that have really been interested in doing these kinds of questions, but just haven't had a support network to do that, and kind of connecting them together, which is really exciting. And now there are other degree programs at other institutions that have been cropping up. I think a notable one is New York University's master's in animal studies, which has been kind of the framework that we've been going off of and trying to start curriculum. Dr. Jeff Sebo, I think, is in charge there. So we've been talking with him, which is really cool, because he's been really knowledgeable on the subject. And he actually teaches classes in animal ethics. I think he's a philosopher by training. And so there are these isolated pools of interested people and bodies of work that relate to animal studies. And the trick is just finding them. And the more I've been getting into this kind of stuff, the more I've been able to find them and realize that, because when I started out, for example, at that conference I was talking about, that was kind of unheard of for me. And at least within musicology as a discipline, that's still kind of regarded as this fringe topic, that like to even get a panel at this national conference was incredible. But then getting outside just one discipline and kind of feeling out who all is there has been really rewarding, because there are a significant number of people working on these things. And so even if you don't get too much maybe institutionalized support as far as like programs go, like it's really hard, I think, to major in animal studies or critical animal studies, for example, because those pathways just don't exist yet. But I think there's a real potential for them to exist in the coming years, based on the degree of support that I've been finding for work such as this.
Have your activism or veganism somehow affected how like your studies in a positive or negative way? Or
I mean, yeah, definitely positive. Like what I was saying before, where they kind of influence each other. And so for me, like I was saying, I guess like veganism, for example, that's not an end in itself for me. It's like that's the least I could be doing to do these things. So it's not, I guess the goal is not for me to be vegan. It's for like it's for total liberation, essentially. And so that's been an underpinning of my work. And so a lot of, especially, so for me particularly, I'm looking at questions, at least right now, questions of representation, rather than perhaps some other critical animal studies perspectives that are looking at different formations of violence against other animals in maybe perhaps different cultural artifacts. But for now, at least, I'm interested in tackling these material histories. But my current work, at least, has been focused on representation of other animals in different kinds of media. So like opera, for example, I was looking at YouTube videos in another section of my thesis, which kind of calling into question this idea of the cute animal video and kind of what are the underlying politics of that. But yeah, and so this kind of commitment to liberation approaches that I've been cultivating in my involvement with activism has also been translating to my work. If at the very least in how I write about other animals, and actually saying, maybe in writing, not just saying animals, but other animals, right? Because the human obviously is an animal. And so for me, like linguistic tendencies are very important in reforming habits of thought about these traditional ways that we like to be in the world and interact with others. And I am really concerned with kind of deconstructing this this category of the animal. So like we talk about things as, or other animals, like, oh, we refer to animals in general as apart from humans, or that can kind of hide these really basically violent tendencies where we're just essentializing and othering other animals, the diverse amount of species life that one kind of label connotes, which is something that the philosopher Jacques Derrida really calls attention to. He had a famous series of lectures, and so that's where I'm kind of taking my impetus from, is this deconstruction of the animal as a category. And so in writing and in scholarship, I think a really easy way to do that is just really look at your linguistic and grammatical tendencies. And so specifying when you're referring to human, specifying like human, when you're referring to some animal, you say other animal if you're relating them to humans instead of just human and animal, if that makes sense. So we're trying to collapse this binary. And that's another thing that I've taken with my overall approach to, for example, the project I'm working on now on red foxes, where it's positing this specific, or like species specific approach to representation. Because even when people are tackling questions of representation regarding other animals, a lot of the time it's just like, oh, I'm looking at representations of the animal in XYZ period art or something like that. And even then is kind of this essentializing tendency that I was talking about. And so for me, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to look at one specific group of animals, because the strategies to represent one group of animals is likely different from another. And so that was my one of my motivations for zeroing in on red foxes specifically, is to combat this essentializing tendency that groups all animals under this label. Even that is not a perfect approach. I won't really go farther than that, because there's a lot to unpack with regards to how we construct species discourses and stuff like that. But yeah. So for me, it's not just a maybe moral or philosophical commitment that's fostered by my activism, but also this really, for me, practical linguistic commitment because for me, how you talk about someone very much translates to how you think about someone. And so that's kind of my basis for trying to incorporate this, not just into my writing, but in speech habits as well.
So you're kind of touching this universal communication between humans and animals. And I like that, because, I've always thought that when you approach an animal, they always like try to look like, are you good? Are you not? Are you, like, how do you smell? And they have their ways of communicating without speaking, so to speak. And then, as you mentioned, how we think about other humans, like better or worse, and then it's similar to how we see animals. And it's so deep. The whole subject, what you're talking about, is like, it's so fascinating. Do you have any like plan in the future to have animal advocacy in your profession or like career? Do you have some?
Yeah, so I'm looking to go to grad school. So I'm graduating this year. I'm taking this next year off. And then I think after that, I'll apply to PhD programs and see what happens. But in the scholarship, I'm hoping to do these questions. So I'm looking to do graduate study in musicology, or sound studies, or some related field like that. But at the same time, the foregrounding of critical animal approaches is basically what I'm looking to do my research in. And so it's looking at questions of liberation and critical animal studies in conversation with questions about sound and the assumptions that we load onto voice in particular. And so that's kind of what I'm looking to do work in, is very sound studies of sound, very much in conversation with studies of liberation. And so on one front, that's where I see my work going. But then on the other hand, I am really interested in, outside the academy, continuing to work with organized activist organizations. That's redundant. Organized activist agencies, perhaps.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'm thinking perhaps after this year, looking into more ways where I can do that outside of a university setting, and then hopefully continue that even as I pursue graduate study. Because for me, it's something that's always going to be at the front of my life, and so whatever I do, I think will put these kind of questions directly at the forefront of what I'm doing.
You said something about like I don't remember what you said exactly, but it made me think like just being vegan is kind of like a drop in the ocean. You want to do more, and I feel the same, and I can totally relate. And what made you take that step towards doing a little extra than just being a vegan?
At least for me, it was something that I couldn't do otherwise. It just felt like this really interesting, I hesitate to say moral imperative, but something approaching that, where for lack of a better word, is kind of this awakening, right? Where you're just like, okay, now I see all of these violences that had previously maybe been flying under the radar for me personally. And so again, maybe changes in diet are perhaps the first thing you can do immediately, right? But then I was like, yeah, obviously I have to do more. And so for me, I really want to spend my energies in towards liberation, essentially. And then by this also kind of corresponded with my interest in other liberation movements, because for me, liberation is not just concerned with non-humans, but like all animals, right, in all forms of life. And so at the same time that I really started getting seriously into non-human activism, also forging connections with other kinds of liberation approaches, anti-racism, anti-capitalism, feminism, queer studies, all that kind of stuff. They have to connect. Like, it's not just, I think that's something that maybe is starting to get more on the radar of a lot of non-human activist approaches, is the necessary engagement with kind of all axes of oppression and not just the animal, right? And so for me, a commitment to non-human liberation is also a commitment to Black liberation, Indigenous liberation, LGBTQ liberation, all of that sorts of things.
Yeah, it's all connected. But there's like so much tradition or old habits, or we're still stuck in this old kind of society with animal industry. So how I mean, have you had some backlashes, and how do you react, like, with all the negative things that people think about activism? Or have you had any experience from responses from people?
I haven't personally, perhaps just because I'm so new, but yeah, I've definitely heard or had friends that have been in similar situations where it's, I guess a lot of times people perhaps don't take non-human advocacy as seriously as some people might like. I think this grows out of certain historically contingent historically contingent circumstances, rather, that kind of accompanied the start of different, or at least in the US, the beginning of a lot of the mainstream animal rights organizations. Because I think historically, the generally American animal rights has been very white, and I don't think that we've quite shaken that. And so I think that, like what I was saying before, is a lot of the maybe refusal to engage with this kinds of questions we're interested come from this collective memory of animal rights as this like colonial white, basically kind of racist institution, which I don't think that's the case anymore. And animal rights is far from a homogenized group of individuals and organizations. But it's also in a different way. It's because of this. No, maybe let me step back a little bit to, I think, fully get people to take seriously this question of total liberation. These other things, these other kind of liberation movements need to also be supported and put to the front, because how are you going to have people be actually anti-speciesist if they can't even be anti-racist, which we've seen is incredibly hard for a large portion of the population. And so, yeah, I think this marrying of different but similarly minded causes is really beneficial. And that starts with a willingness on the part of us to engage with questions that foreground intersectionality, because human exceptionalism is so extremely pervasive, and in some respects it's foundational to almost every human culture. Perhaps not every human culture, but definitely what we like to think of as American or Western cultures. And so, yeah, it's really hard to get outside of this idea that, oh, humans are special in a way that other animals aren't, because on one hand, that is the case. Like, we are special in some capacities, but that doesn't mean that other animals aren't special in other ways as well. And that's the kind of thing that gets effaced. And so it is this really kind of entrenched anthropocentric hegemony that's super hard to shake. And yeah, I think there's a lot of work to be done. But we have people that are extremely invested in doing this type of work. So I think that bodes well.
As you said, like, if all these groups were like cooperating or trying to understand each other more, if we were all like joined together, we would be more powerful, could do more. And it's a bit like that with all the different animal rights organizations as well, because they're all thinking like, oh, this is the best way. No, this is the best way. And some are like, no, we want to be more like mainstream, normal. And some others are more radical. Which comes to my question, what type of activism or like do you think is best, or what's the most effective way to do activism? What do you think? It's a hard question, but maybe you have some thoughts about it.
Yeah, no, this is a difficult one, but yeah, I mean, at least for me, I think it's really important to to approach it from a number of different strategies and standpoints, because I don't think there's going to be this one overarching way that will perhaps prove to be the most effective. And so I think it's great that a lot of people are approaching it from a number of perspectives and prioritizing a number of different things and commitments along the way. At least for me personally, I maybe would like to prioritize approaches that are looking to actively deconstruct categorical animality, which is kind of what I was talking about earlier, where really in everyday conversation and practice and writing and stuff like that, to scrutinize how we're talking about other animals, and put them on, I guess for lack of a better phrase, a more an even playing field with everyone else. That's not to say that we want to erase difference, because I think studies of difference and an apprehension of difference is extremely important in how we're approaching these, because one thing that is effective or responsible or will work with one group or individual animal is not going to work for another. And so it's really important that we have this flexibility and knowledge of how differing lived experiences are playing out, and how we're talking about these things. But at the same time, it's like that's linguistic habits are not going to get us out of this mess. And so, yeah, it's hard to say, because on one hand, I think that a lot of beneficial change can come out of radical movements, such as, I don't know, a lot of the direct action campaigns, or I mean, like I said before, I feel like a lot of these kinds of questions have to be anti-capitalist at base, and so maybe looking to deconstruct, I guess, normalized institutions and economies, instead of trying to exist and operate within them. But at the same time, that is at some point an idealistic view, and so I think it's good that people are not just doing one thing and they're doing multiple things, because it's hard. It's really hard to say what the best path forward is, because I would say the things I do because of my approach to the cause and my personal experiences relating to that, but then somebody else could have completely different experiences that lead them to say otherwise. And so I'm not prepared to be dogmatic about any kind of way forward, even as I personally may hold very strong opinions about certain things. But I think it's great that there's such a variety of approaches to liberation.
You kind of talked a little bit about, like, there's so many ways, and I kind of feel the same way. Like, it's not just one magic fix that's going to be the solution. I feel more like it's an entangled, messy thread. You got to, like, you can't just pull it. It's going to just make it worse. You got to try different stuff, and then eventually it will be looser and easier to manage. And it's like you also mentioned something about these words and how we use animals, maybe as a, you call someone, oh, that was such a damn pig, or it's there's a lot we humans can improve with our language. It's a bit primitive using animals like in words. So, but yeah. The things you're studying with music and having this perspective with interest for animals, there's so many music groups and artists right now that are vegan and putting in some secret vegan messages, and it's really awesome, and that's just growing. And I'm surprised. I'm looking at some rare Russian music, like folk music, and then all of a sudden it's like flashing something, and I'm like, what was that? I'm going back, and I see like it says like vegan and points at the guy that is in the group, and some other band. They're doing some rap music kind of, and all of a sudden they stand and pose, and it's just kind of a 1 second flash, and they're having this Burger King kind of thing they're holding, but it says Vegan King instead. I'm like, what, how did I just discovered this, and it's incredible.
That is really cool, and it's nice to see celebrity figures endorsing these kinds of approaches. And I think the more, because that just lends these kinds of things, it gives them currency in the eyes of popular audiences, right? And so it's really nice to see when a figure you respect for a completely different reason actually uses their platform and says something about liberation. And so, yeah, and I think that's definitely something to aspire to, and like it's something, because at least for me in going into scholarly work, it's like, oh, that's somewhere that these kind of things perhaps are not even talked about at all in some circles. And so to kind of infuse those conversations with with liberatory sentiments is I think something that I hope to do in the future.
Yeah, there's so many interesting things I can just imagine what you could be doing in the future. It's really exciting. I'd love to hear more from you. Like a last question, kind of on a fun note, like if you were like a president or governor, what would you do? What changes would you make, like for animals, or if you just?
Oh, that's a tough one. Yeah, what would get past red tape is my question, but I don't know. I think the default veg campaign is very good. I mean, obviously, and maybe doing away with these ag-gag legislative rules and stuff like that. Yeah, and just overall using the platform to speak about these questions. Yeah, it's. I'm wondering when the day will come where we will have some kind of leading political figure actually win on these kinds of platform issues. But yeah, I just honestly, I think the most egregious thing right now is just factory farming, and so anything I could do to do away with that, that would be the first thing, I think.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, I would totally agree with that. So yeah, thank you so much for being with us, and it was really exciting talking with you. And I feel like I am a little bit smarter now than I was before when I, just started talking. I was like, okay, I had no idea what what you're studying exactly, but I'm so fascinated by this. I'm gonna look it up more. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for watching and giving all our support, your support. Stay tuned for the next episode with BOS Talk interviews. So thanks everyone. So we'll